Claire Mitchell laughed so hard the whole floor turned to look. In her hand was a Harvard diploma, and across the desk sat a 38-year-old single father named Logan Brooks, applying to be a janitor at the Vandelan Group. She asked him loud enough for everyone to hear whether he had stolen the degree from someone or printed it himself. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered to mock the unemployed man with the absurd file. Not one of them knew every document in it was real. So what drives a Harvard graduate to beg for a janitor's job? The rain had stopped by the time Logan Brooks crossed the plaza in front of the Vandelan Group tower, and he took his time getting to the doors. He wore a gray jacket that had lost its shape somewhere around the shoulders, work boots with the leather gone pale at the toes, and a canvas bag with one strap stitched back on by hand. Nothing about him asked to be looked at. He stopped at the revolving door and read the brass plate beside it, the way a man reads something he has never seen before, nor though he had walked past that plate more than 400 times. Inside the lobby smelled like floor polish and cold coffee. A security officer waved him toward the visitor line without lifting his eyes. Logan joined the queue behind a woman rehearsing answers under her breath and a young man in a suit 2 sizes too large. He watched the elevator bank the turnstiles, the way the receptionist sorted people by clothing before anyone had spoken a word. He was counting things. He had been counting things for 11 days. 6 floors above him, on a wall he had chosen himself, hung the framed statement of values he had helped write. Logan Brooks was the chief strategy officer of the Vandelan Group. He sat on the executive committee. He had the 3rd largest signature authority in the company, and his name appeared on every restructuring document filed in the last 4 years. None of the 12 people in the visitor line had ever seen his face, because he had spent those 4 years keeping it out of photographs. He was 38 years old. He lived modestly, drove a truck with 190,000 miles on it, and ate lunch most days at the same diner 2 blocks from the tower. Colleagues who had met him assumed he was the consultant. Colleagues who had not assumed he was a myth invented by the board. Both were useful. The reason he was standing in that line went back 11 days to a room on the top floor where Eleanor Hargrove had set a single sheet of paper in front of him. Eleanor chaired the board of directors. She was 71. She had buried 2 husbands and outlasted 4 chief executives, and she did not waste words on preamble. The sheet showed voluntary departures by month. The line climbed for 14 straight months. In technical operations, it had reached 41% annually. In facilities and support services, it had passed 60. Human resources gave me 3 explanations, Eleanor told him. Wages, the labor market, generational attitudes. I asked for the exit interview data behind all 3. What I got back was a summary of a summary. 22 pages that say nothing. Logan read the sheet twice and asked her one question. He asked whether anyone had ever gone downstairs and watched. Eleanor's answer was that in 3 decades, nobody had. Reports came up. Nobody went down. They agreed on terms in under 10 minutes. He would report to her and to no one else. He would not use his access, his badge, or his title until he was finished. Douglas Whitaker, who ran human resources from the 12th floor, would not be informed, and neither would anyone below him. If Logan found that the problem was procedural, he would rewrite the procedure. If he found it was something else, he would bring her whatever he found. He asked for one more thing before he left the room. He asked her not to protect him. The application itself took him a single evening. He used his real name and his real diploma, and for work history, he listed the jobs he had held before the year he joined the Vandelan Group, and then stopped. Everything after that point he left off the page, which meant the form went out with an unexplained 4-year gap at the bottom of it. That gap was the only thing on the document that was not literally true, and he expected it to be used against him, and he wanted it to be. There was one loose end, and he closed it that same night. Talent acquisition ran on a hiring platform that had never been connected to the employee directory, a gap he had personally flagged in an integration review 2 years earlier and personally deprioritized. On top of that, his own directory entry was suppressed at executive security level, along with the 4 other officers who traveled to negotiations. A recruiter could type his full legal name into her system all day, and the system would tell her nothing except what he had typed into it himself. The hiring floor was on the 4th level behind glass doors marked talent acquisition. Logan signed the visitor log at 9:40 in the morning and sat in a molded plastic chair for 55 minutes past his appointment time. Twice a recruiter came out, called 2 names, and went back in. Neither name was his. At 11:20, a woman appeared in the doorway with a tablet and read his name into the room without looking up from it. She was in her middle 30s, dark hair pinned back hard, and she wore the particular confidence of someone who has never once been on the other side of the desk. Her badge said, Claire Mitchell, Senior Recruitment Specialist. She led him to a workstation in the open bay, rather than an interview room. There were 12 desks in that bay, and most of them were occupied. She did not offer him water. She sat, held out one hand for his folder, and started turning pages while he was still sitting down. The folder had 4 documents in it, a 1-page work history, 2 letters of reference, and a diploma from Harvard University. Claire stopped on the diploma. She looked at it for 4 or 5 seconds, then she looked at him, and then something changed in her face that Logan would think about for a long time afterward. It was not confusion. It was delight. "Okay," she said. "Okay, this is good." She turned the diploma around so it faced the room and held it up at shoulder height, and she laughed. It was not a small laugh. It carried across the bay and pulled heads up from 4 different desks. "Somebody help me out," Claire said. "This gentleman is applying for 3rd-shift janitor, and he brought a Harvard degree." A man 2 desks over rolled his chair back to see. His badge read, Brett Sullivan. He read the diploma from where he sat, and then he was laughing too, and the laugh spread the way laughter does in a room where nobody has ever been told to stop. Claire set the page down and leaned back. "So which is it?" she asked. "Did you steal this off somebody, or did you print it yourself? Because there's a place on Fulton that does these. $40, they'll put any name you want on it." Logan kept his hands on his knees. "It's mine." "It's yours." Claire repeated the words, slowly tasting them. "Sir, nobody who went to Harvard applies to mop floors at midnight. That is not a thing that happens. So either you're lying to me, or you're doing some kind of bit, and honestly, I can't decide which one is sadder." Brett had his phone out by then. He held it low at the level of his hip, the way people do when they believe that makes it invisible. 2 women from the desk cluster near the window came over with their coffee and stood behind Claire's chair to read over her shoulder. One of them said something that made the other one cover her mouth. "Read the work history," Brett suggested. Claire read it out loud. She read the name of the graduate program and let the room react. Then she got to the bottom of the page and found what she had been hoping for, and her voice slowed down to make sure everyone caught it. "Nothing," she said. 4 years, nothing. No employer, no dates, no explanation." She looked up. "So we've got Harvard?" And then a hole. Logan said the gap was in the past, and he was available immediately. "I'm sure you are." Claire went back to the form and found the box marked household status, and she read that out loud too. "Single father," she said, and her voice did something on the second word. "Of course." The bay went quiet for a moment in a way that was not sympathy. It was the quiet of people waiting to see how far it would go. Brett pushed it further. He asked Logan in the tone of a man doing him a favor whether he had considered that a resume like this might be intimidating to the hiring team. Then he asked what the tuition had been. Then he asked whether the loans were the reason for the job application, and he waited with his phone still down at his hip for the answer that would make the clip worth keeping. Logan gave him nothing. He answered the questions that were real and let the others sit in the air, unclaimed, and in doing so he learned something about the room. Silence did not slow them down. It encouraged them. Every unanswered question became proof that they had been right, and the 2 women by the window had stopped pretending they were only passing through and had pulled a chair over. One man at the far end of the bay never looked up from his screen through any of it. He had headphones on and his shoulders were tight, and his nameplate read, Peter Vance, and Logan wrote the name down because a person who works that hard at not seeing something has usually seen it before. "Look," Claire said, and she softened her tone into something that was worse than the mockery. "I'm going to be straight with you, because nobody else is going to be. If your situation is what I think it is, I get it. But you cannot walk in here with a fake Ivy League diploma and expect anybody to take you seriously. You've made yourself a joke. I have 26 applicants for this position, and every one of them brought a resume that made sense." She slid the folder back across the desk and she did not slide it far enough, so he had to lean out of his chair to reach it. "Verify it," Logan said. Claire's eyebrows went up. "The registrar's office confirms degrees by phone," he said. "It takes about 4 minutes. You have my full legal name and my graduation year. Call them." Someone behind her made a low noise of appreciation at the audacity of it. Claire smiled with her mouth closed. "I'm not spending 4 minutes of company time on that," she said. "I'm going to be honest with you, I'm not spending 4 seconds. You know what I would be admitting if I made that call, that there's a chance. And there isn't." She stood, which ended the interview. She told him the position had been filled internally, which was not true, and that he would be contacted if anything changed, which was also not true. Then she turned to Brett and said something about needing air, and the two of them walked toward the break room together, and neither of them looked back at the man still sitting in the chair. Nobody in that bay had asked him a single question about the work. Not one person had asked whether he could operate a floor machine, or whether he could pass a background check, or why a man with that education wanted third shift. 12 people had watched, 5 had laughed out loud, and at least 1 had filmed it. Logan had counted. He walked out through the glass doors and stood in the corridor by the water fountain, and for the first time since Eleanor Hargrove had handed him that sheet of paper, he understood that he was not investigating a process problem. He could have ended it in 10 seconds. That was what ran through his head while he stood there. His executive badge was in the inside pocket of the canvas bag folded inside a supermarket receipt. One phone call to the 12th floor, and Claire Mitchell would have been standing in Douglas Whitaker's office before lunch, and Brett Sullivan would have been handing over his phone, and the whole thing would have been finished and filed and forgotten by Friday. That was exactly what made him keep the badge in the bag, because if he pulled it out now, the story became a story about Claire Mitchell. One recruiter with a cruel streak, 1 bad hire, 1 termination letter, 1 notice to the staff about professionalism. Douglas Whitaker would write that notice himself. He would use the phrase isolated incident, and it would go in a binder, and 14 months of climbing departure rates would keep climbing because the sheet of paper on Eleanor's desk was not the record of one person's behavior. Nobody in that bay had been nervous. Nobody had glanced at the door. Claire had held a candidate's diploma up over her head like a trophy in a room full of witnesses, and not one person had told her to put it down. People are not that comfortable the first time. They are that comfortable the 40th time. Somewhere above that bay was a person who had made it safe. There was a second reason, and Logan was honest with himself about it, while he stood there with his hand on the cold rim of the water fountain. He wanted to know what happened next. Not to him, but to a candidate. He wanted to know whether the notes Claire Mitchell typed into the system after he left the bay would say anything close to what had actually occurred. He wanted to know whether the 26 applicants she had mentioned existed. He wanted to know what the report looked like by the time it reached the 12th floor, because he had read those reports for 4 years, and he had signed off on decisions based on them. And if they were fiction, then he had been part of the machinery that kept the fiction running. Every quarter, he had approved retention spending built on numbers that came up from this floor. If those numbers were shaped before they arrived, then the failure was not only Claire's, and it was not only Whitaker's. It was his too, and no termination letter was going to fix it. Logan went down to the lobby and out through the revolving door and sat in his truck in the parking structure for a long while with the folder on the passenger seat. Then he took out his phone and sent Eleanor Hargrove 4 words. "It's not the wages." Her reply came before he had started the engine, and it asked him what he needed. He needed time, and he needed to stay invisible longer than either of them had planned. He wrote back that he wanted to go through the full process, end to end, every stage as a candidate. He wanted to sit in the group sessions. He wanted to see how the notes were written after the candidate left the room. He wanted to know where a complaint went when someone filed one and how long it survived and who read it last. Eleanor asked him one question in return. She asked whether he understood what he was volunteering for, because it would get worse before it got useful. Logan looked at the folder on the seat beside him at the corner of the diploma his mother had framed, bent now from being handed back across a desk. He wrote that he understood. Then he drove home, and the next morning he came back with the same jacket, the same boots, and the same bag, and he put his name down for the open group assessment on the sign-in sheet at the 4th floor desk. The receptionist, a young woman with a name tag that read Rachel Doyle, looked at the sheet, then up at him, and then back at the sheet. She did not say anything about the day before. She just slid a bottle of water across the counter toward him without being asked, and Logan understood that at least one person on that floor had been watching for a while and had not enjoyed the show. That was the first useful thing he learned. There were people inside who knew. The open group assessment ran for 3 hours in a conference room with the blinds down, and it taught Logan more than the 11 days that came before it. There were 19 candidates. They were seated at long tables and given a written exercise, and while they worked, 2 recruiters walked the aisles and talked to each other about them out loud. Not in whispers. At a normal conversational volume in a room where every person could hear, as if the candidates were furniture that had been arranged for their convenience. Brett Sullivan handled the left aisle. He stopped behind a woman in her 50s and read her paper over her shoulder and made a small sound with his teeth, and the woman's pen stopped moving and did not start again for a full minute. Logan sat in the 3rd row and wrote his exercise in careful block letters and listened. He heard a candidate's dental work discussed. He heard a man's shoes described as a red flag. He heard the phrase, "We're not running a shelter," and he heard the laugh that followed it, and he wrote down the time. Afterward, in the corridor, he ended up beside a younger man who had been at the end of his row. His name was Marcus Reed, and he was applying to the same custodial posting, and he had figured out the process before Logan had. "This is my 4th one," Marcus said. "4th group session, same job, same building. Every time they tell me the position closed, then it reposts 11 days later." He looked at the closed door behind them. "I called once to ask why. Woman on the phone told me the file said poor presentation. That's it. 2 words about a man who has done custodial work for 12 years. Logan asked whether he had filed anything. Marcus almost smiled. "Twice. There's a form on the careers page, candidate feedback. You fill it out, you get an automatic email that says, 'Thank you, your submission has been received.' Then nothing happens ever. I think that form goes into a hole in the ground." 11 days after Claire Mitchell told Logan the position had been filled internally, the position reposted exactly as Marcus Reed had predicted it would. Logan applied again the same morning, and this time nobody laughed because his file had been reassigned to a different recruiter who had not been in the Bay and did not read the notes. Over the following week, he sat through a 2nd-round screening, a skills verification, and a scheduling interview. He sat in the same plastic chairs. He watched the 4th floor the way an auditor watches a warehouse, and the pattern that emerged was not subtle once he knew to look for it. Applicants who arrived in worn clothing were routed to the group sessions, which almost never produced a hire. Applicants who arrived with a referral from inside the company skipped the group sessions entirely and went straight to a named recruiter with a coffee in her hand. Logan watched Brett Sullivan walk a young man past 12 waiting candidates and into a private room within 90 seconds of his arrival, and he heard Brett say the name of the young man's uncle on the way, and the uncle was a director in procurement. He watched a woman get turned away at the counter because her address was in a neighborhood a recruiter said something about after she left. He watched a man with a gap in his work history get asked what he had been doing during it in front of 6 other people, and then watched the recruiter write something down without waiting for the end of the answer. And he watched what happened to the complaints. Rachel Doyle took the printed candidate feedback forms out of the tray at the end of every day. One afternoon, Logan was in the corridor when she carried a stack of them past the copier and into Claire Mitchell's bay, and he saw Claire take the stack, read the top one, and drop the whole thing into the disposal bin beside her desk without turning the page. He asked Rachel about it the next morning quietly at the counter. Rachel looked at the sign-in sheet for a while before she answered. "The instruction is that candidate feedback gets triaged at the department level before it escalates," she said. "That's the word they use. Triaged. I've worked this desk for 2 years, and I have never once seen one of those forms leave this floor." Logan asked who had given the instruction. "It came down in writing," Rachel said. "I still have the email because I never delete anything." She glanced up at him then, and there was something in her face that had been waiting a long time for someone to ask. It didn't come from Claire. That was the moment the shape of the thing changed for Logan Brooks. He had spent 2 weeks building a case against a recruitment bay. What Rachel Doyle handed him over the following days turned it into something else entirely, and he assembled it, carefully, piece by piece, without touching his own access once. He went to Eleanor Hargrove instead. He sat in her office on a Saturday morning and told her he needed 3 things done by people who did not report to human resources. He needed the lobby and 4th floor camera archive pulled by corporate audit under a board directive. He needed the message server preserved before anyone had a reason to clean it. And he needed a list of every candidate who had submitted a feedback form in the last 2 years, which had to exist because the automatic thank you email Marcus Reed described could only be generated from a record. Eleanor signed all 3 that morning without asking him a single additional question. The camera footage came back first. It showed the bay on the morning Claire Mitchell held a Harvard diploma over her head, and it showed the crowd forming, and it showed Brett Sullivan's phone. It also showed 140 other mornings, and in those mornings it showed a pattern that no report had ever mentioned. Candidates left standing at the counter for an hour. Candidates dismissed at the door without ever sitting down. And one afternoon in February, when a man in a stained coat was walked out by a recruiter with a hand on his elbow. The message server was worse. There was a thread 16 months old between Claire Mitchell and Douglas Whitaker, who had run human resources at the Vandelan Group for 7 years. Claire had written to him after a candidate complaint reached her desk in the ordinary way. She had asked how to handle it. Whitaker's reply was 4 sentences long, and the last one said that department-level matters should be resolved at the department level, and that anything reaching the executive committee would reflect on everyone in the chain, including her. 2 weeks after that reply, the written instruction Rachel Doyle had kept went out to the front desk. Triage at the department level. There was more. Whitaker owned a quarterly workbook that fed the retention numbers, and the audit team pulled every version of it going back over a year. The first draft of each quarter contained a category called Candidate and Applicant Experience. In every later version, that category had been folded into a line item called Market Conditions. The change was made by hand. The formula was overwritten with a typed value quarter after quarter, without a single exception. Logan sat with those files on a Sunday and did the thing he was good at, which was arithmetic. 61% of the departures in facilities and support services over 14 months had come from employees who had been with the company less than a year. Their exit interviews existed. They had been summarized, and the summaries had been summarized again. And the phrase that appeared 43 times in the originals appeared 0 times in the version that had gone to the board. The phrase was some variation of the way I was treated when I applied here. That was the answer to Eleanor Hargrove's question, and it was not wages, and it was not the labor market, and it was not generational attitudes. People were leaving because the first thing the Vandelan Group ever did to them was humiliate them, and they never forgot it, and the moment they had another option, they took it. And the department responsible for measuring that had spent 7 years making sure the measurement never arrived. Logan understood then that Claire Mitchell was not the disease. She was a symptom that had been given permission in writing by a man on the 12th floor who had understood exactly what he was protecting. He also understood that he had almost no time left because the audit requests had touched 3 systems, and Human Resources was going to hear about at least one of them. They heard about it on a Tuesday. Logan came in that morning for a rescheduled skills verification, and Rachel Doyle looked up from the counter and did not slide him a water bottle. She said his interview had been moved to the small conference room, and that Miss Mitchell would come get him, and she said it in the flat voice of someone reading a line she had been handed. Claire came out 8 minutes later with Douglas Whitaker behind her. Whitaker was a heavy man in a good suit who smiled with the lower half of his face only, and he did not introduce himself, which told Logan that Whitaker believed he did not need to. He stood at the end of the corridor with his hands folded and let Claire do the talking, and Claire had his file in her hand. "You've been in this building 11 times in 3 weeks," she said. "You've applied for 1 position twice and been to 4 separate sessions. We pulled the front desk camera this morning and watched you standing at that counter, asking our receptionist about internal correspondence. So I'm going to ask you directly, who are you working for?" Logan said he was applying for a job. "No, you're not." Claire's voice was not amused anymore, and that absence was the first honest thing she had ever shown him. "Nobody applies 11 times. You're a plaintiff's investigator, or you're a reporter. And either way, you've been recording people who did not consent to it, and this is private property." She opened his file and took out the diploma. She tore it in half, and then she put the halves together and tore them again, and she did it without any particular drama, the way a person discards junk mail. Then she dropped the pieces into the disposal bin beside the copier and looked at him to see what he would do. Behind her, Douglas Whitaker said the only sentence he said that morning. He said that the candidate's application was withdrawn and that he wanted the building notified. Frank Dolan came up from lobby security with 2 officers. Frank had worked in that building for 22 years, and Logan knew his face, and Frank did not know Logan's at all. He was not rough about it. He asked Logan to come with him, and he kept a hand near without touching, and the walk out went the long way. Past the bay and through the glass doors, and down the main stairs into the lobby, which was the busiest it got all day. Something close to 40 people watched a man in a gray jacket get escorted out of the Vandelan Group tower. Brett Sullivan filmed part of it from the mezzanine. By that afternoon, there was a clip going around 3 internal group chats, with a caption calling him the Harvard janitor, and in the comments, people who had never met him agreed that facilities had dodged a problem, and that you could tell there was something wrong with him, and that Claire had handled it well. At the revolving door, Frank Dolan asked for the visitor badge back. Logan handed it over. Frank looked at him for a moment longer than the job required, and said he was sorry about it in a voice low enough that the officers did not hear, and then the door turned, and Logan was outside on the plaza in the cold. He walked to the parking structure and sat in his truck. In the inside pocket of the canvas bag, folded inside a supermarket receipt, the executive badge had been there the entire time. He had never taken it out. He had been mocked in an open bay, filmed, read aloud, turned away, had his degree torn up in front of a receptionist, and marched through his own lobby by his own security team. And in 19 days, he had never once used the one thing that would have stopped any of it. He sent Eleanor Hargrove a message that said it was time. The response came within the hour, and it did not come from Logan. It came from the office of the board chair, and it went to every employee in human resources, all 34 of them, plus the vice president of operations and outside counsel. A mandatory full department meeting the following morning at 9 in the main auditorium. Attendance recorded. No agenda listed. Claire Mitchell read that email at her desk before she had finished writing up the incident. The write-up came out clean, and Whitaker approved it in 6 minutes, and the file said the applicant had displayed erratic conduct and had been removed as a precaution. She did not connect the meeting to the man in the gray jacket. There was no reason to. She had done what she had always done, and it had always been enough. Whitaker was less relaxed. He walked the floor twice that afternoon and asked Rachel Doyle whether anyone from audit had contacted the desk, and Rachel told him no, which was true, because the audit team had contacted the board instead. He asked his assistant to send the quarterly workbook to his personal address. Then he told 2 of his managers that the meeting was almost certainly about the reorganization rumor, and he said it loudly enough that it traveled, and by 5 o'clock, the department had settled on that explanation and gone home for the night. In the auditorium, the technicians ran a display test at 7 the next morning and left the projector warm. The man they had thrown out of the building was in that moment in a conference room on the top floor, with the board chair and outside counsel wearing the only suit he owned, going through a presentation in order for the 3rd time. He had asked for one accommodation, and Eleanor Hargrove had granted it. He would not be announced. He would come in through the side entrance at 9 minutes past 9 after the department was already seated, and he would walk down the center aisle. Claire Mitchell arrived at 8:50. She took a seat in the 4th row with a coffee and her phone next to Brett Sullivan, and the 2 of them were still talking about the clip when the lights came down. Neither of them knew that the man they had spent 19 days humiliating had signature authority over the department they worked for, and had been sent by the board to evaluate it, and had every second of what they had done to him saved on a server that no longer answered to Douglas Whitaker. There were 4 minutes left. At 9 minutes past 9, the side door of the auditorium opened, and a man in a plain dark suit walked down the center aisle, and for 6 or 7 steps, nothing happened at all, because 34 people were looking at the front of the room and expecting the vice president of operations. Then it started at the back. A woman in the last row had watched the escort clip 4 times the previous afternoon, and she recognized the walk before she recognized the face, and the sound she made turned 2 heads, and those 2 heads turned 4 more. The recognition traveled up the auditorium 1 row at a time ahead of him faster than he was walking. By the time he reached the middle of the room, there were people half standing to see over each other, and a man near the aisle said the word "suit" out loud, as though the suit were the impossible part. In the fourth row, Brett Sullivan understood a full second before Claire did. He put his hand on her forearm without looking at her. Claire Mitchell turned around. Her coffee was halfway to her mouth, and it stayed there. Eleanor Hargrove was standing at the lectern. She said good morning. She said that the board had commissioned a review of talent acquisition a month earlier, and she said that the officer who had conducted that review would present its findings. Then she stepped aside. "My name is Logan Brooks," he said. "I'm the Chief Strategy Officer of the Vandelan Group. I've held that position for 4 years. Some of you have signed documents that carry my name on them." There was a sound in the room then that was not a gasp and was not a murmur. It was the sound of 34 people inhaling at slightly different times. 19 days ago, I applied for a third-shift custodial position in this building under my own legal name, with my own diploma. I did that because the board asked me to explain a 14-month rise in voluntary departures, and because in 3 decades nobody from the executive floors has ever come down to the 4th floor and watched. He did not raise his voice at any point in the next half hour. Logan Brooks had spent 4 years presenting to boards, and he understood that when the material is bad enough, volume only gives people something to object to. He worked through it the way he would have worked through a failed acquisition. The camera footage went first with no audio because none was needed. The room watched a recruiter hold a diploma above her head and turn it toward the desks. It watched 4 people rise from their chairs to come look. It watched Brett Sullivan lift his phone to his hip. Somebody in the second row said something under their breath. In the fourth row, Claire had put her coffee on the floor and had not straightened up. Then the group session. Then 140 mornings compressed into 90 seconds. Logan gave the dates out loud and moved on. He spent under 2 minutes on the email thread with Whitaker and read the 4 sentences into the microphone without comment. He spent barely longer on the quarterly workbook, showing the first draft, then the version the board had received, then the hand-typed value, where a formula used to be quarter after quarter, and he named the account that had done it each time. He watched the room while he did it, because the room was the part he had not been able to predict. Nobody was defending anybody. 2 managers had turned their chairs slightly away from Whitaker's row, which is a thing people do without deciding to. A young recruiter 3 seats from the aisle was crying quietly and making no attempt to hide it. Peter Vance, the man who had spent 19 days with his headphones on and his eyes on his screen, was sitting forward with his forearms on his knees, looking straight at the floor, and he had a folded stack of paper in his hand that he had brought from home. "This is the part I want the board to understand clearly," Logan said. "Every quarter this department reported that our retention problem was external. I approved spending on the basis of those reports. $9 million over 2 years on signing incentives and wage adjustments to solve a problem that did not exist. I signed for that money. I did not verify the input. That failure is mine, and it is in the record with everything else." Douglas Whitaker stood up at that point. He said the word context, and he said the phrase out of, and he said something about a review conducted without notice to the department it concerned, which was a procedural argument, and it was the only one he had. Eleanor Hargrove told him to sit down. She said it in the voice of a woman who had outlasted 4 chief executives, and he sat. Then Logan put up the last section, and it was the one nobody in that auditorium had seen coming because it was not about him at all. 206 names. Every one of them a person who had submitted a feedback form through the careers page in 2 years. Every one of them had received an automatic thank you email. None of them had ever received anything else. The number of those forms that had reached a single human being above the 4th floor was 0. He read 4 of them aloud. He read the one from a woman who had driven 200 miles for a group session and been told at the counter that the posting was closed when it was not closed. He read the one from a man who had listed 12 years of employment and been recorded in the system with 2 words: poor presentation. He did not editorialize on any of them. He read them and moved on, and the reading took 6 minutes, and by the 4th one, there were people in that room with their hands over their faces. Nobody in this company was leaving over wages, Logan said. They were leaving because of the way they were treated the first time they walked through our doors, and because they never stopped remembering it. This department spent 7 years making certain that sentence never reached anyone who could act on it. That is not a personnel issue. That is a control failure, and it has been in continuous operation the entire time. He closed the laptop. 2 people in this building are the reason that presentation exists. The first works the 4th floor front desk. She kept an email for 2 years because she suspected somebody would eventually come asking, and she was the only person here who treated me decently before she had any reason to. Her name is Rachel Doyle. Heads turned toward the aisle seat where Rachel Doyle was sitting with her spine very straight and her eyes wet. The second I only found out about 11 minutes ago. Logan looked toward the far side of the room. He walked in this morning with a printout of every requisition that was closed and reposted in the last 2 years, and the reasons entered on each one, because he made his own copies at the time and could not think of anybody to give them to. Peter Vance did not look up. He lifted the folded stack of paper about 4 inches off his knee and put it down again. Claire Mitchell did not try to speak until the lights came back up. When she did, she got about 6 words out. She said she had not known who he was, and then she stopped, because she had heard the shape of her own sentence and understood what it admitted. It was the closest thing to an insight she had displayed in 19 days. She sat back down and did not say anything else. Outside counsel took the room after that, and it did not take long, and it was not dramatic. Douglas Whitaker was terminated for cause that morning, effective immediately with his access revoked before he reached the elevator. The board referred the workbook alterations to outside counsel for review, because falsifying reports that determine the allocation of $9 million is not only a matter of employment. Claire Mitchell was terminated the same day. So was Brett Sullivan for recording candidates without consent and distributing the footage internally. 4 other recruiters were let go over the following week, and 6 received final written warnings, and 2 of them resigned, rather than accept one. Frank Dolan kept his job. Logan made a specific point of that with the board, because a security officer, who follows a lawful instruction from the head of human resources, has done nothing wrong, and because Frank had said he was sorry at a moment when nobody was listening, and nothing required it of him. Peter Vance kept his job as well, and was moved out of talent acquisition into internal audit within the month at his own request. The reconstruction took 10 weeks, and Logan Brooks ran it himself. He did not delegate it, and he never once used the word values in a company-wide email. He rebuilt the process instead because he had learned in 19 days that culture is not what a company believes. Culture is what a company's procedures permit. Every candidate now received a written decision within 5 business days with a stated reason, signed by a named person. Group sessions were eliminated entirely. Interviews were conducted in rooms with doors. Candidate feedback no longer routed through the department it concerned. It went to an inbox monitored by internal audit, which reported to the board, and every submission received a human response within 72 hours. Internal referrals were still permitted, but they entered the same queue as everyone else, and the referral was recorded on the file so that anyone reviewing it later could see the thumb on the scale. Recruiter performance stopped being measured by how fast a requisition closed. It was measured in part by how candidates who did not get the job rated the way they had been treated. And on the first morning of every new recruiter's employment, they spent 1 full shift in facilities with the custodial team, not as an observer, working. Logan wrote that requirement himself and refused 3 separate attempts to have it removed. Walter Hayes had worked 3rd shift in that tower for 26 years, and he was the man who trained them. He was also the one who had shown Logan how to run a floor machine years earlier, on a night when Logan had come down to the loading dock at 2 in the morning to think back, before anybody in the building knew his title either. Walter told the new recruiters exactly one thing at the start of the shift. He told them that the person who cleans your office knows more about you than your manager does, and then he handed them a mop. Marcus Reed was hired in the 2nd week, not as a gesture and not as a settlement. His application was reviewed by a new panel that had never seen his file, and he was the strongest candidate in the pool, which he had also been the 4 previous times. Within a year, he was supervising the 2nd shift custodial team for the entire East Tower. Logan wrote to all 206 candidates whose feedback had been destroyed. Every letter went out over his own signature, and every letter said plainly what had happened to their submission, and none of them used the phrase, "We regret any inconvenience." 41 of those people applied again. 19 were hired. Then he went after the ones who had already left. 240 employees had resigned from the Vandelan Group in 14 months. Logan's office contacted every one of them. The letter was 3 paragraphs long, and it did not pitch anything. It stated what had been found, what had been done about it, and that the door was open. 62 people came back. 11 of them came back into positions more senior than the ones they had left. The departure curve on Eleanor Hargrove's sheet of paper flattened within 2 quarters and turned down in the third. By the end of the following year, voluntary departures in facilities and support services had fallen from above 60% to under 22%. Nobody spent $9 million to accomplish it. The story got out because it always does. A clip of a man being escorted out of a corporate lobby had already been circulating internally, and when the rest of it surfaced, the trade press ran the whole thing. For a while, the Vandelan Group was a case study in the worst possible light. Then gradually it became a case study in something else, and other companies started calling to ask how the audit-routed feedback inbox worked. Logan gave that answer for free to every single one of them. He did not take a promotion out of it. He turned down 2. What he did do twice a year after that was disappear. There were 16 Vandelan Group facilities in 7 states, and Logan Brooks visited them on a rotation nobody was given advance notice of. He drove there in the truck, which by then had crossed 230,000 miles. He wore the gray jacket, which he never replaced, and the boots. He filled out applications under his own name for whatever position was posted, and he sat in the plastic chairs and he waited to be called. Most of the time, nothing happened worth reporting. A recruiter at the Ohio plant offered him coffee, asked him 3 intelligent questions about floor equipment, told him honestly that he was overqualified, and asked whether he would consider maintenance instead. Logan drove home from that one in a very good mood and wrote her a commendation she never understood the origin of. Twice it went badly, and both times he stayed in character to the end, and both times a general manager received a visit from the chief strategy officer within the week. He kept the torn diploma. Rachel Doyle had taken the pieces out of the disposal bin that Tuesday afternoon before the bins were collected for the night, and she gave them to him in an envelope on his second day back in the building. Logan had the pieces reframed exactly as they were torn, the seams visible, and he hung it in his office on the 6th floor, at the height where a person sitting in the visitor's chair would see it before they saw him. People asked about it constantly. He told them the truth every time, and the story got shorter each year, until eventually he could tell it. In one sentence, a recruiter in this building tore that up, because she could not believe a man who wanted to mop floors had earned it. Nobody in that company judges an applicant by a jacket anymore, not because they were told not to, because everyone who works there now knows what happened to the last people who did, and because they have all spent a shift with Walter Hayes, and because the man whose name is on their offer letter once sat in a plastic chair on the 4th floor for 55 minutes past his appointment time and was laughed at by half a room and never said a word about who he was. Never measure the worth of a person by the clothes on their back or the job they are asking for. A company is only as strong as the respect it shows at its very first door, because the way you treat the people with the least power is the only honest measure of what your culture actually is.